on behalf of FrieslandCampina Institute to our webinar, Combating Nutrition Information, a Continuous Challenge. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome, particularly to those of you joining us for the first time. I'm Dr. Karen Reid. I'm a registered dietitian and sport and exercise nutritionist, and will be your moderator for the webinar today. So FrieslandCampina Institute is a global communications platform offering scientific information on dairy, nutrition and health. And the Institute engages with nutrition and health professionals around the world. So we're particularly pleased to be able to welcome participants from Europe, from Asia and Africa, in particular Nigeria. And the Institute regularly organises webinars such as this and conferences, and also provides tools and resources to support your practice. So as nutrition and healthcare professionals, one of our key roles is to communicate clear, evidence-based information on nutrition. So today's topic is something I'm sure we can relate to in our practice. That is how we can combat nutrition misinformation in the media and better educate our clients. So I'm delighted to introduce one of the world's leading sports nutritionists and exercise physiologists to address this issue, Professor Asker Jeukendrup. Now, Asca has spent most of his career as a professor at the University of Birmingham in the UK within the sports science department. And in addition to that, he's a visiting professor at Loughborough University. He was also the Global Senior Director of the Gatorade Sports Science Institute and is currently director of his own performance consulting business, My Sport Science, and co-founder and chief executive officer of a nutrition planning software business, fuelthecore.com. During his academic career, Asca has authored 10 books and over 200 research chapters and research papers and book chapters. So he's been prolific in terms of publishing in sports nutrition. Asca also brings his experience both as a practitioner in nutrition and also as an athlete himself, having competed a number of Ironman triathlons. He works within high-performance sport in a number of high-profile roles, including performance manager in nutrition for the Dutch Olympic team, Tour de France cyclists, Champions League football teams, and with other elite athletes. But he's also worked extensively with recreational athletes too. I had the good fortune to work with Asca when he was leading the delivery of performance nutrition to UK athletics, and he is an invaluable source of practical advice based on scientific evidence. He's very skilled in addressing the pseudoscience and presenting clear messages. I can also highly recommend his website, My Sport Science. It's one of my go-to places as a great source of credible information. So I'm sure you'll enjoy his presentation today. We have also allowed an extended Q&A session at the end of 45 minutes to give as many of you as possible to put your questions to Asca and join in the discussion. And you can use the Ask a Question box in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And also, please like the questions if it's a topic you'd like Asca to address. So I'd like to extend a warm welcome to Professor Asker Jeukendrup.
Thank you very much, Karen, and also a big thank you to FrieslandCampina to invite me to speak on a topic that I'm very passionate about. The My Sport Science website that Karen alluded to is a place where I try to dispel some of these myths that we have. The title of this webinar is Combating Nutrition Misinformation, and it is indeed a continuous challenge. I work mostly in the field of sports nutrition, but I think a lot of the things we will talk about today you can also find in the field of nutrition. So the title of this could also have been Science Facts versus Science Fiction. And what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about this sense and nonsense in sports nutrition. I will focus more on sports, but as you will see, a lot of this can also be applied to the general field of nutrition. I'm going to talk to you about why I think that we have so many myths. There are many reasons. I'm going to talk about the most important ones. And then I'm going to pick on some of these myths and just talk in a little bit more detail about some of these pretty stubborn myths that we have in sports nutrition, and some of these very strong beliefs that athletes have and coaches have, and even sometimes nutritionists have in this field. So in this slide, you see that I've listed a number of myths that we have in sports nutrition, and I put them into different categories. They're quite arbitrary categories, just ones that I invented. So some have to do with carbs, some with fat, some with protein. Those are really quite big buckets where we find these myths. We also have some in hydration, or some that are linked to timing and diets. So if we go through these, on the carbohydrate side, sugar is bad for athletes. More carbohydrate is better. That's certainly not always true. Complex carbohydrates are slow. Sugars are fast. Insulin is bad. Glucose spikes are bad. You recognize a lot of these sort of very common claims. Under fat, we have definitely in the last few years seen a lot of information about the ketogenic diet and how it is supposed to improve performance of athletes. And we see a lot of supplements that aim to increase fat burning. Why? To help burn fat, to lose weight, and so on. Protein, the more protein you eat, the more muscle you gain. Branched chain amino acids, a very popular supplement with a lot of very strong claims, and there's definitely a very strong belief, especially around that particular supplement, but not a lot of evidence. Hydration, drinking more is better. Athletes need to take electrolytes, so electrolytes are in this bucket of hydration. Endurance athletes need salt tablets. So on the one hand, we tell people don't eat salt, that's not good, but you do need electrolytes. On the timing side, we often hear that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, especially for athletes. We also talk about avoiding carbohydrate before exercise, or just before exercise, the hour before. And then, of course, there is an enormous amount of information around diets, superfoods. My diet, could be any diet, is better than another diet. Gluten-free. Elite athletes cannot perform unless they supplement. So these are some of the myths, and of course I don't have time to address all of these. So what I'm going to do is talk about a few of these. The first one, sugar is bad for athletes. I'm going to talk about another carbohydrate one that is in the bucket of timing, avoid carbohydrate in the hour before exercise. I'm going to talk about electrolytes. One of the reasons I picked that one is also that recently I put a series of 10 blogs on My Sport Science to explain this topic in a lot of detail. There is a very strong belief, I would say, amongst athletes that electrolytes are necessary. So today we'll look at, is that really true? And then on the protein side, a lot of athletes think that eating a lot of protein is very important to gain muscle. So we'll look at those in a little bit more detail. But the first question we need to address is, why do we have so many myths? And also, why are they spreading so rapidly? There are a number of reasons for that. And some of the reasons, not all, some of the reasons are listed here. The first one, I think, is that nowadays everyone has an opinion about nutrition. And that wouldn't be so much of a problem if we don't consider all opinions equal. But we do nowadays. So everyone who has access to social media can share their opinion, and Usually, if you have more followers, you have more impact. Your opinion is more important. Information overload is something we will talk about. And then a little bit in the statistics area, confounding factors, regression to the mean, correlations. We'll talk about those a little bit. I think very often, and this is quite specific for sport, we mix health messages with performance messages, and sometimes they are definitely not the same. For example, there's no question that fiber is important for good health. There's also no question that fiber can cause GI problems in marathon runners, for example. So saying that fiber is good or bad really depends who you're talking to. And that links to this point, is the lack of context. And I realize that I say this point, but you can't actually see my pointer. But the lack of context is an important factor too. And a lot of these points, or many of these points, have to do with how we actually process information. So I'm going to start with saying something that I very often say. Nowadays, everyone who drinks and eats seems to be an expert in sports nutrition. And of course, you can also remove the word sports here, because it's also true for the field of nutrition. And as I already mentioned, everyone who has an opinion about nutrition is free to share this opinion on social media. And this opinion, whether it is evidence-based or not, will be shared with millions of other followers. And this is why bad information spreads very easily. And unfortunately, there is more bad information than there is good information. And therefore, some of the good information is difficult to distinguish from the very large amount of bad information. Now, in this image, you see someone who gets a lot of information from personal trainers, from companies, from friends, from real experts, from nutrition gurus. And this information is coming to them in various forms. Social media is just one of them. There is an enormous amount of information, and you need to filter, like, what is good information, what is bad information. Sometimes that's really difficult to do, because the amount of information you have to deal with is so large that I call it filter failure will occur. And what is happening in today's society in general is that we have much more information than we've ever had before. But at the same time, because of this filter failure, it actually results in less knowledge and more confusion than ever before as well. Now, this has a little bit to do with how the brain works, and I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm going to give you the very simplistic view of how I see the mind works or the brain works. There are three aspects to it: instinct and emotion, and then the thought process. Instinct and emotion are, of course, very ancient parts of the brain, and the thought is the sort of the more developed part of the brain. So if we look at those three parts, and we start at the orange part here, which is the instinctive brain. Now, this is extremely important for survival. The instinctive brain easily overrules all of the rest of the brain. It makes decisions very rapidly, and this is very important because it's a reflexive system, and it's an extremely good system for survival. It doesn't try to analyze things too much. It just makes very rapid decisions and then overrules everything so that you can survive. We also have an emotional brain, also ancient. This is important for our social system. The emotional brain can easily overrule the reflective brain. Everything that so sometimes we think about things, and the thought processes and the analysis will help us to make very informed decisions. That is the more developed part of the brain, the reflective brain, the more modern part of the brain. But it can easily be overruled by the emotional brain. A very intelligent person who can analyze things very well in a traffic jam sometimes does not behave very rational. It is because the emotional brain takes over. The reflective brain is very important. It can analyze things in a lot of details. The problem is that takes a lot of time, and it is very easily overruled by the much stronger part of the brain, the instinctive brain. So imagine we are looking at our phones on Instagram, and we're scrolling through all of these messages, and we're trying to make sense of these messages. There's a lot of information that just passes through the brain, some of it like subconscious, some of it conscious, and very little of that actually turns to the reflective brain to really sort of analyze whether this is good or bad information. We're much more drawn into Instagram by the instinctive brain, where we see pretty colors and nice photos, and that's where we stop and then start to read. So this is part of how the brain works. Now, if I take another example here, and this is a little bit the history of our Easter bunny. So around Easter time, all the shops are full of chocolate Easter bunnies, and we buy them, we eat them, but the history or the background to the Easter bunny is from medieval times. And in medieval times, around Easter, you had mating seasons for the hares. So when you walk through the fields, you can see hares jumping around. And if you walk through the fields, you also see some eggs sometimes. So the connection is very quickly made. Around Easter, we see these hares and we see these eggs. So the eggs must come from the Easter bunny. And that's really where the story of the Easter bunny comes from. But of course, in reality, they're not the eggs of the bunny. They're not the eggs of the hare. They're the eggs of the lapwing. And this is a bird we never get to see because the bird is very shy. So we see the eggs, but we never get to see the bird. But in medieval times, the connection was very quickly made between the hare and then the eggs that were found in the same field. So that's Easter bunny. In this example, the lapwing here is a confounding factor. So our brain, our instinctive brain, makes these correlations really quickly. Hare, egg, it becomes an Easter bunny. But it is actually the lapwing that is responsible for the eggs in the field. Now, if I take that back to, I guess Easter eggs are also nutrition, but if we take this back to the field of nutrition, we do similar things. We see a correlation between sugar intake and obesity. And if you look at these lines, well, it's very tempting to conclude that sugar intake and obesity have something in common and maybe sugar intake is responsible for obesity. But this is the line till the year 2000. Of course, after that, the lines do not overlap anymore. The correlation is not so great anymore. So maybe we have to conclude that, well, actually sugar wasn't the cause of obesity. But of course, these correlations don't tell us anything about causality. We can find a similar correlation between fat intake and obesity, and actually this line is like they go in the same direction for a little bit longer. But we can also do this for bottled water intake, and we all feel that bottled water intake and obesity are probably not causally related. So correlations only tell us a very small part of the story, and it's very easy to draw wrong conclusions. So with regard to confounding factors, I think our instinctive brain tries to make sense of things instantly. Correlation does not mean causation, and we always have to look out for confounding factors, such as the lapwing in the example that I gave. So here's a case report. This is Dave, And Dave says, I made good progress with my training, but then suddenly I felt like I wasn't improving. My personal trainer told me to try X, and X could be all sorts of things. A gluten-free diet, paleo diet, a keto zone, a certain supplement, you name it. I started X, and almost instantly things started to work again. I lost weight, I gained muscle mass. The conclusion is X definitely works for me. Now, this is something that we see in nutrition. We definitely see this a lot in sports nutrition, where athletes are always like judging their performance. They try to measure their performance, try to measure how they feel, like almost on a daily basis, and they try to link it to their nutrition. But what we sometimes forget is that we have good days and we have bad days, and generally it follows the pattern that you can see on the right hand side. If everything has normally a normal distribution, and sometimes we are lower than normal, and sometimes we are, in case of performance, better than normal, and we have this natural fluctuation from day to day, maybe even week to week or month to month. Now, this is what brings us to regression to the mean. So if our average performance is the mean, sometimes we have good days, sometimes we have bad days, or sometimes we have periods where things just do not work, and periods where things work very well. Now, A and B here represent a period where performance is really good, A, or B, where performance is really poor. Now, at what point is an athlete more likely to completely change their diet? Of course, they're not going to change anything when everything is going really well. They're going to change things when things are not going well. And they change their diet or they move to another supplement. And then what happens next? Of course, if your performance is at an all-time low, there's only one way it will go. It will improve. And this is independent of the change in diet or supplement. We call that regression to the mean. Sometimes it's really difficult to tell the difference between regression to the mean and a real change. An athlete may have a very bad day, but is that an early warning of overtraining, or maybe just a blip due to a random cluster of events, such as maybe a bad meal, poor sleep, mental fatigue? Sometimes it's really difficult to distinguish the two. So we talked about some of these factors. Everyone has an opinion. All opinions are equal. We talked about the enormous amount of information that we have to deal with. We talked about how the brain processes information and how sometimes we're not very good at figuring out what the confounding factors are. We talked about regression to the mean and the limitations of correlations and sometimes the strong conclusions that we draw from correlations. And now I'm going to give you some more examples, real examples. And in these examples, the problem is usually the lack of context. So when we draw a conclusion or define a truth, we also have to define the context, but sometimes we don't. And also sometimes we mix health and performance messages, as you will see in the first example that I will use. So the myth that I want to talk about, or that I listed before, is sugar is bad for athletes, but the athletes should avoid sugar. And then in the nutrition field, we hear a lot about fructose. It is a killer, and sugar is the cause of obesity, or the single cause of obesity. And I just want to move straight to fructose, really. So with sugar, we link that to cardiovascular disease, we link it to obesity, and with fructose, we actually have this beautiful mechanism because fructose causes lipogenesis, and that is the cause of obesity. But it could be that that is a little bit of an oversimplification. And I should also say that I am not saying that we should all start eating sugar now or eating more sugar. I'm just saying that we need to understand the context that we say this in. Now, the question on this slide is fructose really that bad? And if you look at all of the evidence, you can find evidence that fructose is bad and it has negative health effects. But that evidence is all coming from either observational studies, from animal studies where animals were overfed, so excess calories in the form of fructose, usually extremely high doses of fructose, and human intervention studies where definitely the doses were super physiological, much higher than you would ever see in a normal diet. Or in those studies, the total energy intake wasn't controlled. On the other hand, we have the evidence against, basically saying, well, fructose is not really that different from another type of carbohydrate. And that evidence comes from systematic reviews and meta-analysis of controlled trials. And this is why I have drawn the person on the right larger and stronger than the person on the left, because these systematic reviews and meta-analysis have a much greater weight, of course, when we weigh up all of the evidence that we have available. Now, we have to get the context right. So, sugar in relation to health is one story, but sugar in relation to performance is a completely different story. Now, there is an enormous amount of evidence that sugar or carbohydrate intake during exercise, or even before and during exercise, have an effect on performance. Here is just one of sort of many reviews. This is based on 61 performance studies with almost 700 subjects. 82% of those studies showed significant improvements in performance and 18% showed no change. There's not a single study that shows a decrement with carbohydrate supplementation. Really strong evidence, and also we have a pretty good idea of the mechanisms. When we look at the recommendation charts, and this is one from one of the publications maybe 10 years ago that we did, where we basically said, well, the main factor that drives the recommendations is the duration of exercise. If your exercise is pretty short, you don't really need any carbohydrate, or maybe there's a different mechanism by which it works. We showed that if you rinse your mouth with carbohydrate, that can actually improve performance, but it has nothing to do with providing fuel. If the exercise is, say, between 45 minutes and 2 hours, 30 grams of carbohydrate per hour is enough. If it's between 2 and 3, you may consider 60 grams. If you go in 2.5, 3 hours, or even longer, you should consider even 90 grams per hour. Now, that's a very large amount of carbohydrate for most athletes. In fact, anything over 30 grams an hour needs a bit of attention for athletes, because it feels like it's quite a lot. But certainly, if you take 90 grams an hour, that is a lot of carbohydrate, at least in the athlete's mind. So, does that have any negative effects? Well, on health? Well, if you just do some very simple, I call them back of the envelope calculations, the answer will have to be no. Because here's some generic facts. In terms of carbohydrate use, during exercise, we use 2 to 8 grams of carbohydrate per minute. We can use carbohydrate anaerobically, and that's why you can go up to 8 grams per minute. You use a lot of carbohydrate in a very short period of time. In terms of carbohydrate intake, we've just seen the advice is 0.5 to 1 gram per minute in most conditions. And in extreme conditions, we go up to 1.5 grams per hour. We also know, on the right-hand side on the carbohydrate balance, that exogenous carbohydrate oxidation, so the carbohydrate oxidation from your carbohydrate source, the ingested carbohydrate, is about 70 to 90% of the intake. We call that the oxidation efficiency. So if we take an example, we go to the second line, 1.5 hours of exercise. Say we use carbohydrate at a rate of 3 grams per minute. So this is conservative. This is not super high. It is very realistic for the vast majority of athletes. So you would use roughly 270 grams of carbohydrate. If we advise that person to take 60 grams per hour, which we would do according to the chart that I just showed you, the intake is 90 grams. Of that 90 grams, we can then calculate in the third column that about 72 grams, 80%, is immediately used as fuel. 18 grams may not be immediately used. So if we do quick calculation, we're still almost 200 grams of carbohydrate in negative energy balance. So if that's the case, how can it possibly have negative effects? We use most of that as fuel. It's not really different if it's 4 hours of exercise. Maybe the carbohydrate oxidation is a little bit lower, 2.5 grams per minute. The carbohydrate intake may be a little bit higher. We go up to 90 grams per hour. But if we do similar calculations, it's also almost 200 grams negative carbohydrate balance. So where is the carbohydrate or where's the sugar that's going to have these negative effects? And in this case, where you're in negative energy balance, you wouldn't even see lipogenesis. Okay, so that's the first myth. The second one that I want to address is also carbohydrate related, and I'm going to do this one a little bit quicker, is a myth that's been around since the late 1970s. And that is that we should avoid carbohydrate in the hour before exercise. And we can still see this advice used today. The paper that caused this is this paper by Carl Foster. It's not a bad paper, it's just a paper that came up with a conclusion, and they say that the present data support our earlier findings, which demonstrated that glucose feeding 30 to 45 minutes before exercise increases carbohydrate oxidation, reduces the mobilization of fatty acids, and thereby reduces exercise time to exhaustion. So they did observe that in the study that carbohydrate was ingested and performance was reduced. The explanation is this very sexy figure that is often used. Say at the left you see the box that says glucose intake. That's where 75 grams of glucose was ingested. 45 minutes later, exercise starts. And in those 45 minutes, we see a rise in blood glucose levels and also in insulin levels. When exercise starts and insulin is high, we suddenly see that this glucose disappears into muscle and all other tissues very, very quickly. And the glucose concentration in the blood drops very rapidly. It drops so low that it reaches hypoglycemia, or it can reach hypoglycemia. And then after that, you can also see that the glucose concentration sort of normalizes again. The body regulates it and it normalizes again. But the argument was that because you now develop hypoglycemia in this first part of exercise, that has a detrimental effect on performance. And you may get the symptoms of hypoglycemia, dizziness, weakness, lack of power, nausea, and so on. Very, very attractive theory, together with this 1 or 2 studies that showed a negative effect on performance. But many years later, if we look at all of the evidence, then this is the balance. We still have 2 papers here from the 70s that say that there's a negative effect on performance if you eat in the hour before exercise. But now we have over 100 studies that show the opposite, either a positive effect or no effect on performance. So We published this paper with the title "The Myths Surrounding Pre-Exercise Carbohydrate Feeding," and the conclusion was, well, there really isn't evidence to suggest that performance is negatively affected by taking carbohydrate. There are more studies that show that there is a positive effect. And maybe when you work with athletes, you just figure out what is best for that particular person. But certainly not a reason to tell everyone not to eat in the hour before exercise. Now, I'm going to challenge something that hasn't been challenged very much. Athletes need electrolytes during exercise. Of course they do. Everyone does. There are so many companies that sell electrolytes in tablets, in drinks, in different forms, sprays, you name it, because there is already this extremely strong belief amongst athletes that without electrolytes they cannot perform, especially when it's hot. You need electrolytes. Of course, here we have a number of the electrolytes, and there's no question electrolytes are important for normal physiology. They support the nervous system, it retains water, it helps to maintain a neutral pH. It's very important in muscle contraction. Of course, all of that is true. And this healthline is from a website that usually has pretty good sort of evidence-based information. And from that website, I picked this exact sentence. Water and electrolytes are lost in sweat, and it's important to replace them, particularly during long duration exercise. That is exactly the statement that I would challenge. Not that water and electrolytes are lost in sweat, but they are. But I'm questioning, does that mean that we have to replace them immediately? Or can we just wait till the evening meal when usually we're told, well, there's too much salt in it anyway? So that's my question. So fortunately, it had a reference, number 10, a trusted source. So I looked up the trusted source, and somewhat to my surprise, that was one of our papers. In this paper, Nutrition for Endurance Sports, Marathon, Triathlon, and Road Cycling. So it's a review paper that came from an IOC consensus meeting that we had in 2010. And I was like, wow, I'm being quoted to support a statement that I'm not even sure. So I had to read this paper again. And I did. And indeed, I did make a statement in this paper. And the statement was, a drink should contain sodium for optimal fluid absorption. That's not quite the same than this statement. Water and electrolytes are lost in sweat, and it is important to replace them, particularly during long duration exercise. This doesn't say anything about the importance of replacing it. It just says that for optimal fluid absorption, sodium plays an important role. But it has a reference. The reference is Ron Mon, and I looked up that paper and to see what exactly that paper said. And it says the available evidence indicates that the only electrolyte that should be added to drinks is sodium. So this statement is water and electrolytes, and it suggests that we need to replace them. But really, this paper says it's only sodium that we would ever have to worry about. It also says that when the exercise duration is likely to exceed 3 to 4 hours, there may be advantages of adding sodium to drinks, maybe to prevent hyponatremia. Well, so we've gone from some suggestions here to a quite strong statement in this publication that I think is normally pretty evidence-based. And the statement that we had in this particular paper, a drink should contain sodium, came from observations like this one. So this is one of our studies that we did where we basically gave water and then added different amounts of sodium to see what the water delivery or the water appearance was in the blood. So I won't bore you with the details of the study, but we used deuterium as a marker, measured that in blood, and essentially is how rapidly does the drink that we ingest appear in the circulation. And yes, you can see that water is actually the slowest of these. So when we add sodium, it looks like water appears a little bit faster in the circulation than with the others. And that's where the statement came from. There are several other studies that also show this effect, but you could also, and I think we have to look at this data and say, okay, how important is this difference here? The difference seems pretty small here from a physiological point of view. You may say, yes, sodium has this effect, but is it really physiologically significant? But the bigger statement that was made is like, we need to replace the electrolytes that we lose. That's one that I really want to question, because I'm going to focus on sodium only now. In the body, we have 70 grams roughly of sodium, and we have a blood sodium concentration of 140 millimoles per liter that is maintained within very, very narrow margins, and it needs to be. It's very important that it is maintained at that concentration. We can certainly not tolerate a drop. And this is how the body regulates this. So in this slide, you see the electrolytes in the body and also in sweat. And although it lists all of the electrolytes, let's just focus on the bottom one, which is sodium. So we have the total amount of body sodium is 70 grams. The amount that we lose per liter of sweat is somewhere in the region of 0.46 to 1.84 grams. So you need to lose a lot of liters of sweat before you really significantly deplete the body sodium stores. The other thing to note is that the blood concentration of sodium is 3 to 3, or the blood amount of sodium is 3 to 3.5 grams. So there is this gradient. Sweat is always much more dilute than blood. What that means is when we sweat, we lose more water than sodium. So we're actually concentrating the amount of sodium in the body. So if we are really worried about a reduced sodium concentration in the blood, then actually sweating is doing the opposite. It's helping us to concentrate and increase the concentration of sodium in the blood. Now, we can model all of this. There's a couple of papers that actually allow us to model the sodium concentrations in the blood depending on what we ingest. And this is something that we can use to then predict what we need to ingest in terms of water and sodium in specific situations. Now, first of all, I want to show you that sweat rates can be extremely high and extremely individual. So this is just some data that was collected when I worked with the Gatorade Sports Science Institute. And you can see that there are some differences between the sports, but even within each of these sports, there's this huge range in sweat rate between individuals. And if we look at the blue line on the right, all sports, you can see that sweat rates can vary somewhere between 0.2 and almost 3 liters per hour. Huge differences in sweat rates. I'll come back to that in a minute. But if electrolytes are that important, and considering that everyone believes that it is so critical, you would expect that there are a lot of studies that show that the electrolytes have an effect on performance. Well, in this slide, I show you all of the 5 studies that we have in the entire literature that have investigated the effects of sodium on performance. To me, Like, I have never been really into the field of electrolytes. Most of my research was in carbohydrate and fat metabolism, a little bit in protein. And it is only more recent that I started to look into electrolytes a little bit more. And to me, it was shocking that there were only 5 studies. And of those 5 studies, there are only, 4 studies showed no effect of sodium at all. So I won't go into the details of the studies, but you can read the blogs if you want to know that. One of those studies actually showed a positive effect on sodium. So it's probably interesting to look at that study in a little bit more detail. They looked at a half Ironman distance race, and they supplemented with sodium or not. But they didn't control any of the other intake. So we don't really know what they were taking in terms of carbohydrate, in terms of fluid. And the effect that was seen on performance was so large that it was unbelievably large, literally. So there's no way that sort of effect can be subscribed to sodium. So I think we need a lot more studies before we can actually say, well, sodium is important. Now, if we go back to this, to these papers that help us to model sodium concentration in the blood, and in this particular graph, what you will see on the horizontal axis is the proportion of sweat that is replaced by drinking. Say if I lose 2 liters per hour, I'm drinking 1 liter per hour. That would give me 50%. Or if I'm drinking 90%, which very difficult to do if I'm sweating 2 liters per hour, then I would be on the right side of this figure. On the vertical axis, so how high these bars are, that is how much sodium needs to be replaced to maintain plasma sodium concentration. And then yellow, light yellow in front is if your sodium concentration in sweat is lowish, and then to red where it is very high. So from this figure, you can see then that really, if you do not lose a lot of sodium in sweat, you really don't need to worry about replacing sodium, unless maybe in some cases where you replace a very large amount of the fluids you lose. If we go to, say, the red, so you now lose a lot of sodium in sweat. If you're only replacing 50% of the fluid you're losing, you still don't need to worry. But if you start to drink like a lot and you're replacing 70, 80, 90%, and you're sweating an enormous amount of sodium, this is when sodium replacement may be important. So we turned this into a little table, so a decision chart for athletes. So the first question in this chart is your exercise duration less than 4 hours? In that case, don't worry about sodium. Just take it or don't take it. It doesn't matter. But if your exercise duration is more than 4 hours, well, let's see what your hourly sweat rate is. If you sweat more than 1.8 liters per hour, actually you don't need to worry. Maybe this is a little bit counterintuitive, but that has to do with the fact that if you sweat more, you actually concentrate your body sodium concentration more. If you sweat less than 1.8 liters per hour, well, then let's see how much of that fluid you're actually replacing. If you're replacing less than 70% of that 1.8 liters per hour, don't worry, you don't need sodium. If you're replacing more than 70%, then let's look at what your sweat sodium concentration is. If it is less than 1 gram per liter, you don't need to worry about electrolytes. But if you sweat more than 1 gram per liter of sodium, then let's replace 30 to 65% of sodium losses. So what this says is that in probably 99% of the cases, we don't need to worry about sodium. There are cases at the bottom left here where you may need to replace some of the losses, not even all of the losses, some of the losses. So now, just a summary of this whole field of sodium, because there are reasons why people say we need to take it before, during, or after exercise. Before exercise to retain fluid, well, there's actually strong evidence that it retains fluid, but we don't have evidence that that is really useful. During exercise, we have claims that it helps the absorption of fluid. And I think the answer is yes, it does. And you can find studies that show it. The effects are relatively small. It helps to maintain blood sodium concentration. I think that is only true in really extreme conditions. It avoids the depletion of body sodium. Really, we have no evidence. Maybe this is the case in extreme conditions, but the evidence isn't there. I didn't mention this at all, but it's often linked to preventing cramps, but really we have little or no evidence that that is the case. And I showed you the performance studies, all 5, little or no evidence. After exercise, can we use sodium to retain fluid? Yes, there is strong evidence. How useful that is a different story, but there's strong evidence, especially if no, or only if no food is consumed. And replacing sodium deficit, well, that will only help in extreme conditions. So the real summary slide is here, 3 points. Only when athletes exercise for more than 4 hours and drink large amounts, and they have sweat losses of sodium of 1 gram per liter or more, then you may need to think about supplementation. Humans do have body stores of sodium, and we can use these stores. The size of these stores is relatively large, and it's very unlikely that we deplete them. And what would happen in almost all practical situations, we would get dehydrated well before sodium depletion would occur. And then the third point is just that scientific evidence has time and time again failed to demonstrate the link between electrolytes and exercise-induced muscle cramping. Final myth that I will talk to you about is protein. The more protein you eat, the more muscle you gain. This is still quite a strong belief amongst some of the people that go to the gym, especially the muscle heads, where the message still is more protein is better. But we do know that there are a number of factors that determine how much protein we synthesize. Partly, one of the reasons is, or one of the factors is the dose, so the amount. The timing of when we take it, the type of protein is important. The pattern of intake, so whether you take small amounts frequently or large amount less frequently, and whether we take it with other nutrients. And this slide just shows that we have amino acids that can be incorporated into protein, and those proteins are then broken down into amino acids, and this turnover constantly takes place, breakdown and synthesis. If we now feed in through nutrition a lot of amino acids, this turnover will continue. What will increase is the oxidation. So it is not necessarily true that if we feed more amino acids that it will be used for synthesis. It will largely be used for oxidation. The other factor that is really important is, in order to build muscle, exercise is a really important factor. So combining protein feeding with exercise is important, but the exercise is actually the main driver of protein synthesis. And there are a number of dose response studies, and this is just one of them, but they all show pretty much the same thing, where they gave different amounts of protein, and in most of the studies they've done these studies with whey protein, and then they measured the fractional synthetic rate of muscle protein, so protein synthesis essentially. And you can see here that if you go from a low intake of maybe 5 grams of protein to 10 to 20, there's an increase in protein synthesis, but doubling your intake from 20 to 40 has little or no effect. It certainly wasn't statistically significant. And this is repeated by other studies. So it is not necessarily true that if you ingest more, that you will also use more for protein synthesis. There are probably other factors that are much more important. And we know now that maybe the distribution of the meals is important. And every meal distributed maybe like 3 to 5 hours apart needs to contain about 20 to 25 grams of protein, and ideally with 3 grams of leucine. If we do this, and we do this in this case 4 times in a day, we 4 times maximize protein synthesis, and that would really help us to maximize protein synthesis during the day. The final example here is a little bit different. The first 2 meals are small. They contain very little protein, not enough to maximize protein synthesis. The next 2 meals are extra large, and you do get maximal protein synthesis, but maximum protein synthesis with this large peak is the same as maximum protein synthesis in the example before. So in the example at the bottom, we've only used or maximized 2 of the meal opportunities in the day, whereas in the first example, we have maximized all 4 opportunities. So essentially, this is showing us that we cannot make up for a missed opportunity earlier in the day by just having a larger meal later in the day. So the distribution of protein is probably more important than just the total amount of protein that is ingested. So I hope that I've definitely given you a few things to think about. Maybe some of these myths you already realized that they were myths, or there wasn't that much evidence. Maybe some of these have been new to you, and I'm more than happy to discuss this. But the fact is that this is a continuous challenge, that we have people communicating information that is not always good information. And I think the only way that we can beat this is by education. Education, not so much about the facts of nutrition, but education about how do you approach the data, how do you look at data more critically. And that is something that I feel nowadays is disappearing a little bit. We're not critical enough looking at data, looking at claims. So I'll leave you with that thought, and then I hope we have some questions to answer and we can have some good discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Asca. That was really excellent. I really enjoyed your presentation, and you addressed so many important issues, particularly with the practical examples you gave. Very thought-provoking, and some very useful examples as well for us to think about. So we have plenty of questions coming through in the Q&A. So thinking about thought-provoking, if we can move to some of the questions. Actually, the first question point that's come through, a few people have picked up on this. Would you be kind enough to just run over on one of your earlier slides on carbohydrate? I'm not sure if it was the 4th slide or around about that time. There's a query around carbohydrate intake and the rates of carbohydrate intake or utilization. Are you able to see the query?
Yeah, I can see it, and yeah. So if I ever said 1.5 grams per hour, that is definitely a typo. It's 1.5 grams per minute. So the 90 grams per hour is sort of the high end of the intake, which is 1.5 grams per minute.
Well, people were paying attention, so well done.
That's good. Yeah. I should have been.
Great. Okay. So on the theme of carbohydrate, the next question. My apologies. I'll just come back to it. Unfortunately, now I've managed to turn off my questions. Are you able to see?
Yeah, I can see the question. So so I've got a question. What should be the time between intake of carbohydrate intake and activity? So I think in the vast majority of cases it doesn't matter, I think is the answer. If you really want to avoid the hypoglycemia that I talked about, then it is best to take it maybe 10 minutes before exercise, because then by the time you start exercising, the insulin hasn't peaked. Insulin is still relatively low, and the risk of hypoglycemia is really reduced. We've done studies where we try to take the carbohydrate much earlier, but you have to take it like more than an hour and a half earlier if you really want to avoid this hypoglycemia. But on the other hand, I think we've also done studies to show that there really isn't any effect on performance. So why would you worry about it? And in many cases, people don't even notice the difference. So why not take carbohydrate? So that would be my answer to that question. There is, if you go even further before exercise, maybe 2 to 3 or 4 hours before exercise, now that carbohydrate intake has a different role. So then you're still increasing your body stores of carbohydrate, but with what you do in the, say, hour before exercise, you're not really changing your stores anymore. You're providing directly fuel during exercise, because most of that carbohydrate will be absorbed as you have started the exercise already. So slightly different.
Thank you. I'm back into my questions again. So a question on the type of carbohydrate.
Does it mean consuming processed sugar in every meal is okay? I don't think that was my, that's not what I would recommend, I think. I think if you can probably get away with it if you're a very active person, but even then I wouldn't recommend it. But if it is around the exercise, that's a different story, because if you want to really fuel that exercise session and get the effects on performance, then it is important that, well, then processed sugar is fine. It's not a problem, because you're just providing a fuel. The rest of the day, and maybe then the rest day after this, you just want to eat healthy. And I'm not sure that processed sugar has a place in a very healthy, normal diet. So I would then say, like, some is probably okay. In moderation or small amounts, it's fine. But that's exactly what I was talking about with, let's not confuse the messages where we talk about health versus the messages where we talk about performance. And the real difference is when do you, and how targeted is the sugar intake or the carbohydrate intake. If it really is to fuel that particular session, there's not going to be a problem at all. In the period after that, you can probably find different sources of carbohydrate that are a little bit healthier.
Thank you. And we also have some questions around timing of carbohydrate as well. What about the ideal time of carbohydrate consumption, particularly pre-exercise, I think, as well?
Yeah, so that's similar answer to the one that I gave. So if you so if it links to the pre-exercise, it is partly probably a little bit trial and error, but there's really it doesn't matter that much. If you're really afraid of hypoglycemia, then just take it just before 10 minutes before the start of exercise, and then you will not get any hypoglycemia. So yeah, very similar answer to that previous question.
And then another question looking at carbohydrate oxidation in a non-exercise situation, so just during daily lifestyle activities. Is this relevant?
Is it relevant? Well, it is probably relevant. Maybe not so much in relation to performance, but it could be relevant in relation to health. But I just did a webinar a couple of days ago with James Betts, who's done some really good work in this area. And they're really still trying to figure out whether, like, if you have an increased fat oxidation and a reduced carbohydrate oxidation, does that have any sort of positive effects on health? And it's not as clear-cut as you would expect. I mean, we often assume, like, if you're able to burn more fat, then that has a number of health consequences. And I think in the discussion that we had afterwards, we talked about the turnover of fat and how important that is. And of course, it's inversely related to carbohydrate oxidation. High fat oxidation would mean low carbohydrate oxidation. The other thing that I would say in relation to this topic is that we found that there are very large differences between individuals in terms of their metabolism. Some people are very good at burning fat, some people are very good at burning carbohydrate. And we can explain some of this by looking at diet, by looking at how trained they are, by looking at when was their last meal, things like that. But all those factors together can only explain a very small percentage of the variation that we see between individuals. So there's still a lot that we don't understand. And I've studied this mostly in relation to performance. The interesting thing is that there doesn't seem to be a link to performance. So you can have two elite athletes with completely different metabolism competing next to each other in the same sport. I personally find that fascinating.
And it's certainly a complex area, and it's an emerging area of research as well. So, similar question: would there be situations where reducing carb intake enhances fat utilization?
Yeah. So I think this is a good question, and definitely like a hot topic for the last few years. My personal feeling and bias would be that yes. If you reduce your carbohydrate intake, that will help you to burn more fat. In theory, that should also help you to increase the machinery that you need, the enzymes that are relevant in fat metabolism, and therefore you should be able to increase your capacity to use fat. We do have evidence for that. So if you put people on a ketogenic diet, for example, they enhance their ability to use fat. At the same time, they are reducing their ability to use carbohydrates. So whether you've improved something in terms of performance or not is then the question. So what I would suggest is that it is very important to, as an athlete, to have an engine that can use all fuels, that can use fat, that can use carbohydrate. So sometimes it is probably a good idea to enhance or to do training that helps you to enhance fat use. Sometimes you probably should do the opposite and train your body to use carbohydrate as a fuel. And so that is a topic that we call periodized nutrition, where you think ahead of what is it that I want to achieve with the training today. Is it enhancing fat metabolism? Well, in that case, let's use nutrition to support that idea and really reduce the amount of carbohydrate intake, at least before the exercise. And then on other days, you may want to really increase the quality of the training. And that means you need to fuel it really well. And fueling really well means high carbohydrate, at least around the exercise training session.
Thank you. We've got lots of questions addressing the scientific aspects, but coming back to the theme of today's webinar, what we have to do as practitioners, as nutritionists, is convince our clients. So would you take a moment just to reflect on some of these issues and give us any tips on how we can do this?
Yeah, so this is sort of what I ended with, I think, is that in order to get to this point, we also need to get people to think a little bit differently, not just accept everything that they read or accept everything that has pretty pictures with it, because that's part of it too. I think a lot of the companies that make these claims, they have the marketing budgets to make sure that it all looks really well, whereas I think a lot of us, like trying to communicate to athletes as practitioners, we don't have those resources, and so we're competing with big marketing departments to communicate our messages, and our messages are often, and also the messages that I like now get across in this in this presentation, they're not as sexy as some of the messages that these companies would have. So it's almost like unfair competition, and the only way we can win that battle is by getting the clients to think differently and think more critically and ask questions. And yeah, the big question is really, how do you do that? And I've got another lecture that I give with a lot of ideas of how you could do that, and like how do you. The lecture is about how do you make athletes more aware, and how should they approach the information that they see on nutrition. And very often it starts with recognizing the language that is used. So how do you recognize whether the language is scientific or the language is really just pure marketing? So that's one of the easiest things that you can teach clients, teach athletes, and that's how you very quickly can at least figure out, are we dealing with science or pseudoscience?
And on the same theme, another question, obviously, as university educated nutritionists, dietitians, sport and exercise nutritionists, it's how we break through this noise and misconceptions, especially around social media.
Yeah, it's the same answer. I think it's because it's almost like it's impossible to compete with the enormous amount of misinformation. You can't stop people communicating their opinions. What we need to do is educate, well, especially our children. I think that not all opinions are equal, and there are good sources of information and bad sources of information. There are ways to recognize whether you're dealing with good information or bad information, and sometimes that is more difficult than other times. But definitely we need to teach children, that if we see the before and after pictures, and it's that is pretty obvious sometimes that we're not dealing with science. They're just two pictures of a person before and after, and may not even be the same person. And in a different talk, I have some very good examples of sort of imagery that is sometimes used. And one of those images that I use has a guy who looks a bit pale and a bit sad, and then that is the before picture. Afterwards, he is actually very happy. He has in the picture a girlfriend. He has a tan, and the image has a subtitle that says, "James has now gained 10 kilograms." And that came from a magazine, which on the other side of the page had the same guy, and the advert was something very similar. He looked pretty sad and pale in the left picture, and he was all bulked up in the right picture. But the subtitle on that one was that he lost 20 kilos. So it is things like that. It's just, yeah, it is just it's all fake, and those are things that people should be able to recognize really, really easily.
And I think there's on that theme, there are a lot of fads on social media. Things come to the fore at particular times, and this is and some of these there may be some science or evidence, but they are controversial opinions that sometimes get promoted. Any thoughts on this question about keto adapted athletes?
Yeah, so this is one of those things where we have a little bit of evidence, but then there is such a strong belief behind this whole system, and it's not looking objectively at what the evidence really is. And yes, you can, like, first of all, like in this question is like, I would ask, can we please have a definition of what keto adapted means? Everyone talks about keto adapted, but I've not once seen one person define what is this. If we cannot define keto adapted, how can we possibly test it? And that is key of what pseudoscience is. They tell you something that cannot be tested. If you cannot test it, you cannot disprove it. You can also not prove it, but you cannot disprove it. Keto adapted, I don't know how you measure it. No one knows, because there is no definition of keto adapted. And I have some vague idea of what they mean, but the problem with that is that I show them a study and say, look, here we have some people that are keto adapted and they're not performing better. Their immediate response is, well, then they were not keto adapted long enough. So if we don't define what keto adapted means, we can never get to an answer. So there's this joke about sort of keto adaptation is like, how long do you need to keto adapt before you see an effect? It is 1 day longer than the longest studies that show that it doesn't work. So it's we only have studies that show that it has no effect on performance, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. And you made some very important, good points about the context of the advice. And we have a question that relates to that in terms of fiber and the context. So when we're getting questions or giving information out, it's about considering the context.
Yeah, this is really important. But I think the answer to this question is relatively easy, because it is you and the client that have to figure out what is the goal, what are we trying to achieve. So if I'm talking to a marathon runner who wants to run London Marathon in a few days' time, and they've had the last 3 marathons GI problems, well, then I would definitely look at their fiber intake the days before, and I would definitely advise them, well, let's reduce it as much as you possibly can. We have very clearly defined what the goal is. The goal is not to be sort of overall health or something. It is, let's run this London Marathon without GI problems. If I talk to someone else who doesn't want to run a marathon, just wants to be healthy, it is a very different story, of course. So I think you figure it out with your client, but it always starts with defining very clearly what is it that we're trying to achieve here. And it can, of course, be that goal changes from day to day or from week to week. So it could be that on Monday I'm talking to an athlete who wants to burn fat, and that same athlete on Friday wants to train the gut and burn carbohydrate and have a really high quality session.
And I guess it may change depending on the time of season and training competition cycles as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, we have another question on the myths, some of the myths that you mentioned. So a question about why breakfast is the most important meal of the day. How has this myth come about? Why do people believe this?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I can definitely answer this from like an athlete point of view. There is the idea that the studies early on showed that liver glycogen is depleted or nearly depleted when you wake up in the morning. And we also know that liver glycogen is important for prolonged exercise performance. So the idea, and then the only way to replenish liver glycogen is by having a good breakfast before you go and exercise. So the idea came from that, and that's why athletes have often been advised, well, you have to have breakfast because otherwise you will do your exercise with depleted liver glycogen. But it comes down to, well, what's the goal of your exercise? Maybe your goal is to burn fat. In that case, the breakfast is not important at all. That's actually, the breakfast would kill your goal. So in that case, I would say, well, let's skip the breakfast, go out, do your exercise with low liver glycogen so that you get the training adaptation that you want. In sort of the health context, this is a much bigger question that James Betts, for example, would be much better to answer, because he spent a lot of his career trying to address this question, and he has mostly addressed it in terms of the link between breakfast and then weight gain or obesity. And does it have a role to play? And one of the things they show is that if you skip breakfast, for example, it doesn't really help, because one of the things that will happen is that people seem to adjust their physical activity later in the day. So they are less active if they don't have the breakfast in the morning. So there's no advantage of not having it. But yeah, whether it's the most important meal of the day is, like, why would breakfast be more important than the evening meal? Why, for an athlete especially, why would breakfast be more important than the meal they have immediately after exercise? So I think I would find it easier to make the argument that what you eat like immediately around exercise is more important for athletes than what they do the rest of the day.
And I guess it also depends on what time they're training.
Absolutely, yeah.
On the topic of carbohydrate and different things, fads and ideas that come to the forefront, particularly when certain elite athletes might follow particular diets as well, which is something that people may choose to follow. What about gluten-free athletes versus normal diet athletes and carbohydrate? Are there any advantages of a gluten-free diet before an endurance event, for example?
For a normal healthy athlete?
That's yes, for a normal healthy athlete. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, the answer is no. There's no advantage whatsoever. Maybe a disadvantage that the food wouldn't taste as good, but So yeah, there are no studies that show that gluten. It's also like, why would gluten have that effect? It's just a protein. So yeah, definitely no evidence there that gluten-free would be better than not for healthy athletes.
Yeah, unless of course a gluten-free diet is prescribed, and then the athlete would.
Yeah, if you've been diagnosed, then that's a completely different story.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of athletes, of course, that are self-diagnosed, and that's the problem here, I think. That's actually a really good example of one of the sort of how myths are born. So if you go back to like many years ago now, I can't remember exactly before what year, but if you go back in history, there is a time in history where suddenly gluten-free becomes a massive business. The point at where that happens coincides with a tweet by Miley Cyrus, where she basically tweeted, "Gluten are crap." That was the tweet. And then everyone on social media, like I don't know how many followers she has, 60 million or something, and they all retweeted this, and they all started to talk about how gluten are crap. And that from that moment on, the sales in the gluten-free industry just went through the roof. Really annoying for the people that are actually really on a gluten-free diet and have to be on it. Because they know why they're on it, and they know what a hassle it is to be on it. So so it's you can actually I've got a slide that I sometimes use in presentations that shows literally like that's the date that the tweet was sent, and then in the like months after that, just the whole industry ramps up to a multi-billion-dollar industry.
And it comes back to, again, the good point you made about having your filter on the sources of information.
Yeah.
Which is often a point I make to athletes when I'm working with them. Now, changing the subject a little bit, let's move on to protein and thinking about different sources, the protein source. How important is this?
Yeah, it is important, especially like there is a difference between the quality of the protein, if it's animal based or plant based. There definitely is a difference. So if you give, say, 20 grams of animal based protein and plant based protein, and you look at the protein synthetic effect of the two, animal protein will be much more effective than plant based proteins. It depends a little bit on which plant-based protein, but all plant-based are going to be inferior to animal-based. Now, we also know that if you want to get the same effect, you simply have to eat more plant-based protein. So if you had 20 grams of animal-based protein, you can compensate by taking maybe 30 or 35 grams of plant-based protein, and you would probably get the same effect. The reason has to do with the amino acid composition of the proteins, which are like usually very complete in animal proteins, and probably the most important amino acid is leucine. So I mentioned that you need about 3 grams of leucine to maximize protein synthesis. And most animal sources of protein have that anyway. In plant-based, there's a lot of sources that have relatively low leucine content, or if they have a relatively high leucine content, they lack some of the other amino acids. So there are ways around it. You can mix different sources of protein, and as I said, you can simply eat more. But so yeah, the easiest way is, or the most manageable way is still animal protein, in my opinion.
Okay, and on the theme of protein, we come on to timing. What's your view about pre-sleep snacks?
Yeah, so the good friend of mine, Luc van Loon, has done quite a few studies in this area where they looked at pre-sleep protein ingestion, and the idea was that it's actually quite interesting. We see sleep as the recovery period, and good sleep for us is all important. So when athletes go to sleep, what actually happens is that their protein synthesis is the lowest of the whole day, because that's the only time where you don't have any sort of feeding. You have a relatively long period without feeding. So whether 20 grams of protein is enough to counteract that effect and increase protein synthesis during the sleep, that is a bit of a question. I think you need probably a little bit more protein than that, but studies with 30, 40, and 60 grams of protein definitely show that you can increase protein synthesis during the night while you're sleeping, and that would be the function of taking it pre-sleep. It would not help the sort of the breakfast depletion that I talked about, because that's more glycogen related. So you would still you would still use your liver glycogen while you're sleeping, and it will still be suboptimal when you wake up. So if you want optimal liver glycogen stores, you still need breakfast.
Yeah. And a further question on the quantity of protein per meal in optimizing protein distribution.
Yeah, so I think, so is there a downside to eating large amounts of protein? Not for all athletes, but for a lot of athletes there is, because if you're eating more protein, it usually goes at the cost of carbohydrate. And if it does, then that can have negative effects on recovery. It can have negative effects on performance. So we see this quite a lot. Athletes that focus so much on protein that they are reducing carbohydrate intake. And that's so you don't gain anything by taking so much protein, but you lose a little bit by not eating enough carbohydrates to recover properly.
Thank you. On another topic you covered is sodium or salt. So following on from the example you gave, what advice should we be giving on salt?
I need to know the context a little bit more to really answer this question, because if it is for health, well, definitely, I think no salt is definitely never the advice, because we do need salt, we do need electrolytes. So low salt, I think that's also not the message that I would say I would send to athletes, because most athletes sweat a lot. They lose a lot of salt, a lot of sodium, and it needs to be replaced. So on a 24-hour basis, it's okay if they have a higher sodium intake. I think my point in the presentation was you don't need to worry about replacing it immediately during exercise, because you're going to suffer or something if you don't. It's difficult to answer it without knowing exactly sort of in what context the question is asked. So for who is this advice? If it's for an athlete, I don't think many athletes would want a low salt diet. For the average person who doesn't sweat, that's a different story. So.
And sports drinks. It's a big commercial area with a lot of research that's been done. And this question relates to that research that's led to the development of sports drinks. So perhaps you could comment on the points made in this question.
So sodium, I think I showed the one slide where there is a small effect of sodium on sort of fluid absorption. There is no effect of sodium on glucose absorption. That's I read that sometimes, but we've done a study looking at that. There's zero effect, even though you need sodium to get glucose into the body. Of course, so it's a sodium coupled transport, but clearly sodium is not sort of limiting for that process, and the same sodium can be used over and over again. So there is a small effect on fluid absorption, but I don't think it is really that important. You certainly don't need large amounts for it. It helps to rehydrate. So rehydration suggests it's after exercise, and that's I think one of the areas where I say, yeah, that's true. So it helps with fluid retention after exercise. So say someone loses 1 liter of fluid after exercise. If you wanted to replenish that really quickly, you need to drink a lot. If you drink a lot, you would urinate a lot and lose a lot of the water again. And you can retain a little bit more water by adding in sodium. And generally more sodium will help you to retain more. But the question is that, like, in what situation is that really important? And normally you have enough time until the next training session. So you can just have a normal meal. You can just drink normally. You don't need to be as aggressive with the strategy. So yeah, there's probably a lot of questions within this question, but I think, like, if you choose a drink, a sports drink for this purpose, if you need the glucose, if you need the carbohydrate, well, make sure that it contains that, and that is important. Does sodium help in addition to that? Maybe a little bit. So why not have a small amount of sodium in that drink? You don't need larger amounts. You don't need all of the electrolytes. You just need sodium.
Okay. Well, we'll take just a couple more. One further question on sodium, and looking at sodium losses during exercise. You mentioned about the fact that this can be quite an individual thing that needs to be assessed. How would you suggest sodium losses can be determined?
There are a number of ways that you can measure sodium losses in sweat. So the traditional way, or the most used way, is by using sweat patches. It's quite sort of a laborsome bit of work where you can make a lot of mistakes. But essentially, you put a patch on the skin, you collect sweat, then you take the gouge from the patch. I usually put it in a syringe, and the sweat goes into a little tube, and then from that little tube you analyze your sodium content, and that is your sweat sodium. That's the most commonly used method. The problem with that is you put this patch on one part of the body, and we know that every part of the body sweats differently. So you then have to extrapolate from this very small part of the body to like a whole body sodium loss. And when you do that, of course, you're going to make some mistakes. The validation of this sort of thing is done by like a whole body wash down. So in that case, you do the exercise in a bathtub, and you have an amount of water in the shower that you recirculate, and you just shower constantly as you're cycling with this little bit of water, and all of the sodium that you lose is trapped in a relatively small amount of water. And you do you measure it, you do some calculations, and that is your total sodium loss. That is the best method, but of course totally unpractical in most situations. The most practical way to do it is a very sort of recent development. They are sweat patches that send a signal to your phone. And so there are several detectors of sodium on the market. You put a sweat patch usually on your forearm, and then you keep it on there for like 15-20 minutes, and you make sure you sweat, and then that sends a signal to your phone, and it gives you a pretty good indication whether you are low, medium, or high salt sweater. So the couple of companies now that have these patches, I think will further develop. But the big question I would ask is, how important is it really to know this? I know that, like, I worked with Gatorade, and I used to ask that question. We do so many of these sweat tests, but then if someone, how much sodium someone loses. Like, what do you do next? If I've just told you that, well, we don't really need to replace it during exercise, doesn't matter knowing exactly how much you've lost, because you're going to have a big evening meal that probably has more sodium than you need. And the problem is solved. So with some of the elite athletes that I work with, I still want to know in what category they fall, whether they're low, medium, and high, because it could be that they're involved in very prolonged exercise, and then the high sodium sweaters, but relatively low sweat rate. So that would put them in the higher risk category. So I do it with that population, but I think for most people, I don't think it's that important.
Thank you for that, and a comprehensive answer again. So one for you personally, Asca, about your upcoming course.
I'm not even sure which one this refers to, because there's a few things that are coming up. So I'm trying to sort of guess which one this refers to. So we have a conference coming up in Holland, the Leaders in Performance Conference. That is the 5th of October. And then we have a We Nutrition conference, where this is a conference where I try to bring the whole world of sports nutrition together, literally, like from all countries. And the best way to get the dates for those is to just follow me on social media. And then I also do like a 6-week pretty intense course where I work with a small group of nutritionists and dietitians, with really like looking at all of these things in a lot of detail, and just helping them to be more effective in the real world, sharing a lot of experiences that I've had working in elite sport, working in big companies also, working in software development, and so combining all those experiences and sharing that. So that's called that program is called Mastermind, but I usually advertise that through social media as well.
Okay, well, it's time now, unfortunately. I think we could go on with more and more questions, but thank you so much for all your contributions and questions today. It's made for a very interesting Q&A session, and thank you, Asca, for answering and addressing the questions, and an excellent presentation, which was, as I say, really thought-provoking. For me, I think I always have takeaway messages after listening to you. Reflection is very important. Whatever stage of our career we're at, reflecting on the science and reflecting on our practice is a continuous process, and reviewing the advice that we give. And like you say in your course, doing that within peer groups as well, and sharing and reflecting and discussing these ideas. I think that's important for addressing some of these difficult questions. I think context is another message I take away. We have to be very clear about the context in which we're giving advice, because that may vary. For example, on sugar advice or advice on salt, depending on whether it's to the wider population or to an elite athlete. the context will be very different. And finally, and it's a bit of advice I give out to that I've picked up over the years, is to have your filter on in terms of where the information's coming from. And I try and encourage sports people and athletes that I work with to be quite critical of the source of the information as well, in terms of what they listen to, because there is so much noise out there. Well, thank you also to FrieslandCampina today for hosting this webinar. It will be available on the FrieslandCampina Institute website. And also at the end of this webinar, there'll be a link for you to subscribe to our newsletter. So if you join our newsletter and become a subscriber, you'll receive a link to the webinar and instructions will follow you. So thank you everybody for attending and for your questions again. And we hope to see you again soon. Please stay in touch with FrieslandCampina Institute.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Karen.